gender expression. Did that happen with men and women?
Yes. Yeah. The host was a woman who did male drag with a bigote and bow tie and whatnot. But you could say that the trend was much more for men to play with femininity than women to play with masculinity in terms of participants. But this could also be due to a higher male attendance of the event as opposed to female attendance or trans attendance. But I'd say it was probably 60-40. 60% male identified and 40% female identified. And the drag closet did have clothing for playing with masculinity or femininity. Mm-hmm. Okay,
just an observation. You chose to mention Russia in light of recent legislative initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
Given the scope of the symposium, I thought it would make a lot of sense to mention African countries, Anglophone African countries, right? Especially in light of Tanya's presentation as well, where certain homophobic behavior and discourse is associated with Afro-descendant communities. We could equally make the case that they can be associated with African communities. It would be a very easy mistake to make. Unless we accept that kind of homophobic discourse and behavior exists in African countries to the extent that those African countries were and are still colonized by other discourses. So it's not a surprise. I think that these newer legislative initiatives are happening in Anglophone African countries where there's an immense influence of certain evangelical currents. I'm thinking of Uganda and just last week Nigeria, and we're talking about an immense country. So it would be interesting to look at those connections. I have just one more observation that I need to make, and I have to leave, unfortunately. In terms of the origin of the word viado in Brazilian Portuguese, I'm convinced that the association with deer is made a posteriori because, and I'm judging by my own experience being from Portugal, I always heard the word before I ever saw it written. And as I heard it, I immediately made the association with deer, with the animal, but I think it makes all sorts of sense to think that it comes from the word transviado, right? Someone who goes by devious ways, and so it's just short for transviado, rather than having a direct association with an animal, which comes after the fact. And thanks to the three of you for the wonderful presentations.
But in Brazil, the word viado, as Steve mentioned, it's part of this cultural aspect of this game which is prohibited. It's called jogo do bicho. So the number that corresponds to the deer, to viado, is number 24. For example, I used to teach elementary school, so it's traumatic for any student, if it is a male student, because you have a list of names, and if it corresponds sometimes to 24, José, and then, so because nobody wants to be, have that correspondence with number 24, because jogo do bicho is a cultural institution in Brazil. And it's illegal. So, for example, you have the avestruz in number 12, and porco, all these things, but viado is 24. So it does, it's linked to what Steve explained. Like, for example, the aspect, the deer is more like a nice looking animal, even the males. Delicate and so on, and of course, I have a lot of
fashion conscious.
In Brazil, it is linked to the jogo do bicho, with the game that goes on under the table, and it is very important in Brazil. Well, since 19th century, it goes to Carnival and all these escolas de samba. They have they get funds from this jogo do bicho that is supposed to be legal. Yeah. So, and so I think I have some questions, but I also have some questions later on. And I think we have an appointment with the department chair at 5. Oh, well, we'll be there for his meeting. So, any more questions? Or?
I had a question for Tanya. Tanya, I'm wondering, as you're kind of mapping these networks, right, in many different ways, using the interviews and participant observation, if it's, I mean, when you were talking about what the artists themselves were saying, it came to mind how their own discourses, right, sometimes engage with, right, dominant discourses. So, Eres Bella, right, the song, and I'm not sure if it was, I'm assuming it was prior to 2006.
Yes.
But the way in which, right, the Crudas talks about being guerrilleras, right, or guerreras, guajiras, I think they said, or campesinas, right?
Yes.
And lo colonial, I mean, that's straight revolutionary state discourse.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering, and this has been argued with Cuban hip hop and not just Crudas, right, but the way in which certain artists appropriate state discourse to open up a space. And at the same time, can rework those discourses or not, right? And so I'm wondering the way in which the artists themselves portray what they're doing, you know, is a tactical move sometimes
Yes.
that can reconfirm certain dominant discourses
No.
strategically, but can
Reinforce in some
it
ways.
can reinforce. But I mean, I accept the possibility that it also challenges.
Yeah.
But I wonder up to what point, and I'm wondering, for example, if the songs that are coming out of Crudas now, post-2006,
So.
utilize those same markers in the letras, right, in the songs themselves, or in their interviews. And again, I'm not trying to say either they're naive or they don't understand what they're saying or anything like that, but rather that how one uses discourses to negotiate. And that is necessarily kind of what John's thing, right? You both kind of have to play the game, but you're challenging it. But even as you play the game, you see certain territory while you're opening up other territory.
Yeah.
And I even see that with some of the things that you said that from Chile's interview,
Yeah.
right?
That's-
About body politics and body consciousness.
Yeah.
Part of that is challenging. Another part of it is, Afro-Brazilian culture, African culture in general is embodied culture. Do you know what I mean? How
Yeah.
that can also play into reconfirming, even as it's challenging. So I'm wondering if you could comment on the discourses used by the artists themselves, either in their songs, in the way they use music, right?
Yeah.
Or their interviews.
It's a great question. So, I don't think that we should approach the artist discourse as is an anti-discourse to everything.
Right.
They're making critiques and they're making interventions, and at times there are things about state discourses that they don't disagree with. So in Chieli's case, she's not anti-capitalist. She wants to expand the capitalist enterprise to include people, and she wants to do that through micro-business, helping people to learn it. So she's not against that at all. She sees it as a good thing, and that's her choice. If that's what she believes, then good for her. In the case of Las Crudas, in their context, that is a play on word. That is actually, so first of all, the Cuban underground hip hop movement are revolutionary subjects. They identify with the Cuban Revolution, and they consider themselves to be the followers of Che. A lot of the artists in Cuba, one of the things that I think is largely understudied in Cuba is the way in which Cuba's cultural sphere developed. One, through the state's socialization of culture, but it's not exactly just the socialist state by itself that decided to do this, right? There are all of these actors that were invested in the revolutionary process in and of itself that encouraged that to be a key aspect of revolutionary policy. So with that being said, the cultural sphere in Cuba actually functions as a sphere of social critique, debate, almost like as a nascent
civil society. So these artists don't see themselves as being anti-revolutionary. They see themselves very much as furthering the revolutionary process, and they embrace it, although they have heavy critiques of the limits of revolutionary discourse and policy. So in terms of talking about guerrilleras, that sort of thing, that's not just embracing state discourse. That's talking about, those are key words that every Cuban understands. They were all taught that. It was drilled into their head. So it was one of those types of things where it was, that in and of itself is a unifying discourse, bringing everyone together. It's an effective discourse that is very much a part of the way that their consciousness has developed as a revolutionary subjects. But at the same time, they do see themselves as revolutionaries, right? And so they're embracing revolutionary discourse by saying that, because they're saying, yes, we are revolutionaries just like this, and we're going to push things in this direction to further the revolution. So the other thing is that one of the things that Las Cruces were heavily invested in was actually producing discourse. So sometimes, like, I get a little uneasy with thinking about things like, unconscious appropriation of discourses. I think a lot of times they're very conscious of what they're choosing to say, and they're very conscious, and they're politically strategic in which discourses they decide to use in their discourse. And they were actually, and they still are, involved in the process of naming. They used Cruda discourse for a while. They used New Caribbean feminisms to talk about a feminism that pertained actually specifically to the Caribbean. When they're outside of Cuba, they use the term queer, because that's the best translation for their ideological project into another language, right? So these folks in Cuba, in terms of discourse, are actively involved in that. And in the case of someone like Chieli, I think it reflects her thoughts and her agenda and her goals, not so much that they're all coming from this perspective that, in the same way that they're completely going to continue a revolution or have a revolution. Lou, on the other hand, rejects it all, right? And it's just like, I don't have anything to do with it. So you would find more of an absence of that in her interview. Did that answer your question?
Perhaps one final question.
I found it interesting that both Steve and you, Tanya, are working with groups in São Paulo. So I want, the question that I have for Steve, since, in some ways Tanya has addressed the issue of women, do we have any feminist or any lesbian intellectual or lesbian in São Paulo that responds to these points that you addressed in this very kind of machista, in some ways, argument, like the ideology behind this publication? And why, both of you, have you looked at any other groups in Rio, for example? But I want to see if, do you have anybody who has responded to this?
The most, it was very interesting in that I don't want to take the time to get my data out right now, but as far as asking the questionnaire, and I was very careful to have sort of a fair representation across gender lines, across race, across sexual orientation, because I was trying to get a sense of, are there certain conclusions that we can make about how self-identified lesbian women conceive of a piece like this, or words that are in this, as opposed to self-identified gay men, and then also across racial lines and across class lines. And that's why in the survey that you had, there's a question about income, for example. And one of the things I didn't really get to talk about that that I wanted to sort of at least begin to address is kind of the intersectionality too in Vajubá, which is also known as Pajubá, which is known as, are you familiar with the term Vajubá? It's the language of the travestis, quote unquote. So this was the sort of coded secret language to avoid persecution from the police and other authorities and other officials, that they would not be allowed into the language. But the origins of Bajuba, if you look linguistically at the origins, they come from Yoruba, okay? So it definitely has African origins. So you look at sort of how a language has been adopted that transcends various levels of marginality, whether it's on the basis of race or on the basis of being considered the marginal language from the hegemonic language choices or the languages that are imposed. And what has become so interesting in that process is sort of as the peripheral language of Bajuba becomes centered and mainstreamed and therefore adopted by the more hegemonic gay male community, it no longer has its resistance. It no longer bears its mark of resistance because it's sort of the code has been broken. Even if it's been broken within an in-group, quote unquote, within the LGBT, if you will, community, it's still a hegemonic part of that LGBT community, which is the gay men that have adopted most of the expressions in the 1,300 entries in here. And if you look, a large percentage come from Bajuba. So that it's actually was a language of travestis to avoid persecution that was then mainstreamed into hegemonic homonormative culture, and therefore kind of marginalizing the travestis even further in a way. It's kind of interesting to look at that. I know I'm not really answering your question about sort of have there been challenges. The interesting thing that has come out of the language in the Gestionaria and the questions that you have, I think there's like 32 terms. Of the 32 terms, there were only maybe 2 or 3 that were identified across the lines of gender, race, socioeconomic class as fairly consistent, even though there's some really interesting variants and fascinating and sometimes really funny actually. Variance in conceptualization of these terms, but the vast majority were seen as, I have no idea what you're talking about, whose language is this? This is not my language. I'm gay, I'm from Sao Paulo, or I'm lesbian, I'm from Sao Paulo, I've lived here all my life, but I don't know what this word means. So it's interesting in that respect. And for the most part, the self-identified lesbian women had even sort of less of a recognition of the terms that supposedly related to women, were terms that were still used and employed by the gay male population to refer to women, right? But of course you have the exceptions of sapatão, and a couple of exceptions here and there that are also in group, that are also self-claimed, right? But very few. So that, and I don't think, Lucia, to finally try to answer your question, I have not seen that as being addressed by feminist scholarship that looks at this question in Brazil of the absence of women's language, if you will. It has not, to my knowledge, been challenged. It's been something that has been called to our attention, and it's certainly not a Brazilian phenomenon by any means. We see it in North American culture, we see it in cultures all over the world, the invisibility of women, and then the further marginalization and erasure of lesbian in that process. So it's nothing new, and it's certainly a product of a patriarchal system, of the oppression that brings. A kind of erasure, but it's something that hopefully someone in this room will take up in a future project, not necessarily connecting to Brazil.
2 people, Serginia da Silva, who's out of Sao Paulo as well though, and Sueli, and I'm blanking on her last name, but I think it's Corelia or something like that. They write about these issues, and it's also difficult because the Black social movements are so marginalized in the larger public sphere in Brazil. So I'm going to be there for most of this year, so I should be able to talk more about it. There's a very important person, Osmundo Onyo, I think is his last name. He's at University of Texas right now, but he's known as like the scholar right now on queerness and black queerness in Brazil and masculinity. And then also it's coming out again in the music cultures. There's a huge, I don't know, gay, funky, homo funky scene. And it's actually dominated right now by lesbians, but they're not all black. The one thing I forgot that when you asked me that awesome question, this is an important point of clarification as well, and that is I'm not saying that blackness is only corporal. So
Yeah, I wasn't
okay.
assuming that you were saying that. I was
Okay.
talking about how she presented herself.
Yeah, okay.
And
Okay, I
not
just
even
wanna make
criticizing that, just saying what are the limitations.
Yeah, so because it's like, it's hard to get into it, and that's something that in my next book project, I really want to sit down and really kind of and think about.